Welcome to this deep dive. If you are listening right now, I know you are the learner.
You're the kind of person who sits down in a boardroom or drops into a complex policy discussion and actually wants to understand the underlying mechanics.
Right. You don't just want the headlines, you want the structural framework.
Yeah.
You follow the news, you know the basics of how the system operates, but you also know that decoding complex systems often comes down to mastering the jargon.
The jargon that insiders use to gatekeep information, yeah.
Exactly, and you want to gain that knowledge quickly. And you want to do it without drowning in all the unnecessary noise.
Which is why we're here.
Yes. Today, we are focusing on a very specific piece of United States Congress jargon that is, it's a notorious trap for the unwary.
Oh, absolutely. And it is a trap precisely because it sounds so innocuous. I mean, it's the type of phrase you see buried on page 4 of a political analysis or casually dropped by a panelist on a Sunday morning show.
And people just sort of nod along.
Right. They nod along, assuming it's just standard bureaucratic paperwork, while completely missing the massive procedural weight it actually carries.
The phrase is the blue slip.
Yes.
And our source text for this deep dive is incredibly narrow, which is part of what makes this so revealing, I think. We are looking solely at the Wikipedia disambiguation page for the term blue slip.
A disambiguation page.
Right. Which, look, disambiguation pages only exist when human language fails us.
When a single term is used for fundamentally conflicting concepts.
Exactly. And we need a digital graphic cop to sort it out. Depending on which chamber of the United States Capitol building you were standing in, a blue slip means two wildly different things.
Wielded by different people.
For entirely different constitutional purposes.
And that structural split is the foundation of our analysis today. The text makes it immediately clear that blue slip or blue slipping does not refer to a single legislative procedure with minor variations between the chambers.
No, not at all.
It refers to two distinct procedural tools. If you try to apply the rules of one to the other, your understanding of the legislative maneuvering completely falls apart.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to actually decode this jargon, we need to spatially separate these concepts.
We really do.
We have to look at how this term behaves in the United States Senate first, examine the specific language used to describe it, and then see how that completely flips when we move over to the House.
Starting in the Senate is the right move. The text provides a highly specific definition for this chamber. It notes that in the U.S. Senate, a blue slip is the slip on which the senators from the state of residence of a federal judicial nominee give an opinion on the nominee.
Let's isolate the variables in that definition, starting with the target of federal judicial nominee.
Right.
This iteration of the blue slip is entirely tethered to personnel. It is not being slapped on legislation or policy initiatives.
No, it's about people.
Yes, it is a procedural mechanism specifically designed to address individuals who have been nominated to serve on the federal bench.
And not just any procedural mechanism. What's fascinating here is the hyper-localized nature of this power within a body designed for national perspective.
That's a great point. The Senate is inherently a federal institution.
Exactly. But the text specifically restricts the use of this slip to the senators from the state of residence of the nominee. It is a formal, documented carve-out that grants a jurisdictional privilege to two specific individuals out of 100.
So the geographic tethering is critical. It creates a system of localized gatekeeping.
The localized gatekeeping, yes.
So if a nominee resides in Michigan, the procedural framework dictates that only the two senators representing Michigan receive this slip. The senators from Arizona or Vermont are excluded from this specific step.
Right. The system is structurally validating the idea that geographic proximity to the nominee grants a uniquely relevant jurisdiction over the process.
It's like, okay, think about it like this. Imagine you are trying to move into a highly exclusive new apartment building. The landlord is the one who ultimately approves your application, right?
Sure.
But before the landlord even looks at your paperwork, the building's rules require you to get a formal character reference from your current roommates.
Oh, I like that.
Because your current roommates are the ones who actually live with you. They see how you operate day to day. The landlord is basically saying, I have the final say, but I want the people geographically closest to you to weigh in first.
That's a perfect analogy. It forces a federal process to pass through a local filter. But notice the specific action the text associates with this slip.
The opinion.
Yes. It says the home state senators use it to give an opinion on the nominee.
That word opinion carries a lot of nuance in this context. It did not say cast a binding veto or issue a confirmation.
Right. An opinion, strictly speaking, is just a stated perspective.
Yet the fact that an entire procedural mechanism, complete with specialized paperwork, exists solely to solicit this opinion implies that it carries significant institutional weight.
Huge weight.
You don't create a formal blue slip process if the opinion is meant to be ignored.
And that is the crucial tension in the Senate definition. The formalized documentation of an opinion elevates it beyond casual input. By requiring a physical or formal slip to be returned, the procedure institutionalizes the home state perspective.
It embeds the localized view into the permanent record of a federal appointment.
Yes. Going back to your apartment analogy, it's not just your roommates mentioning to the landlord in passing that you're a good person. It's a formalized, signed document that goes into your permanent application file.
It is essentially a jurisdictional check, like a specialized committee reviewing a project before it reaches the broader board of directors. The board still has the final say, but the specialized committee, in this case, the two home state senators, gets a formal, documented opportunity to signal their approval or raise red flags based on their localized oversight.
And the blue slip is the mechanism for that signal.
Right.
And that framework keeps the Senate definition contained and coherent. We are dealing with personnel, we are dealing with a geographic restriction based on the state of residence, and we are dealing with the formal submission of an opinion.
It is a localized check on a federal appointment.
Which gives us a very clean mental model for the Senate.
It does. But this is where the disambiguation page proves its worth. Because if you take that mental personnel geography opinion and try to apply it to the other side of the Capitol, it shatters instantly.
Completely shatters.
We are leaving the Senate now and stepping into the United States House of Representatives. And here's where it gets really interesting. Because the House's version of the blue slip operates on an entirely different set of institutional impulses.
The contrast is jarring. The text states that in the U.S. House of Representatives, a blue slip is a rejection slip.
A rejection slip.
We immediately move from the solicitation of an opinion to an outright refusal.
The word rejection completely changes the posture. The Senate is asking for input. The House is shutting down the process.
Shutting it down cold.
And the targets of this rejection are just as different. The text specifies that the House uses this slip for tax and spending bills.
So we have completely abandoned personnel and judicial nominees.
Entirely. The House blue slip is exclusively deployed as a weapon of financial jurisdiction.
It is a procedural hard stop aimed directly at legislation. But the text provides a very specific trigger for this rejection. The House doesn't issue a blue slip just because they disagree with the tax rates in a bill.
Right. It's not a policy disagreement.
No. They issue this rejection slip to tax and spending bills sent to it by the Senate that did not originate in the House in the first place.
The origin is the entire ballgame here. The House isn't evaluating the policy merits of the bill when they use the blue slip. They are evaluating the bill's birthplace.
Yes.
If a piece of legislation dealing with taxes or spending starts its life in the Senate, gets passed, and is sent over to the House rejects it procedurally.
The blue slip is their way of saying, you lacked the jurisdictional authority to start this conversation.
It is a defense of institutional territory. The House is asserting that the power to initiate financial legislation belongs exclusively to them.
And when they apply a blue slip to a Senate-originated tax bill, they are essentially invalidating the Senate's procedural standing on that specific issue.
It really highlights the friction inherent in a bicameral system. The Senate clearly felt they had the authority to write and pass the bill. Otherwise, they wouldn't have sent it over.
Right.
But the House uses the blue slip to act as a jurisdictional bouncer, stopping the bill at the door, regardless of what the legislation actually does. But the underlying justification for this rejection is where the text introduces the most crucial nuance.
This is key. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the justification the text provides is revealing. It states that the House issues these rejection slips per the House's interpretation of the origination clause.
The phrase interpretation of the origination clause is incredibly loaded.
Extremely loaded.
The text does not say they issue the slip based on the universally agreed upon rules of the Constitution. It specifically flags that this action is driven by the House's interpretation.
That distinction is paramount. By highlighting the word interpretation, the source text acknowledges that the application of this constitutional clause is not an objective, immutable fact.
It is a perspective.
A perspective maintained and enforced by one specific chamber. The House reads the origination clause, determines the scope of what constitutes a tax and spending bill, and then actively polices those boundaries using the blue slip.
It implies a level of subjectivity that makes the procedure much more aggressive. The House isn't just following a rule, they are enforcing their subjective reading of the rule onto the Senate.
Right. They are saying, this is how we read our constitutional mandate, and we possess the procedural mechanism, this blue slip, to force you to abide by our reading.
And that enforcement mechanism is unilateral.
Exactly. The House does not need the Senate to agree with their interpretation in order to issue the rejection slip. The slip functions as a self-executing defense of their institutional ego.
They define the boundary, and they penalize any Senate legislation that crosses it.
This completely reframes how you should view the term when it pops up in political analysis. The Senate blue slip is a tool for localized influence over lifetime judicial appointments. The House blue slip is a blunt force instrument used to defend a chamber's constitutional interpretation of its own financial power.
They share a name, but they represent entirely different pressure points in the legislative system.
Which perfectly illustrates why disambiguation is necessary. The shorthand of legislative jargon often collapses complex structural conflicts into simple overlapping terms. If you fail to separate them, you misdiagnose the political friction entirely.
So what does this all mean? How do you, the learner, take this highly specific disambiguation page and turn it into a practical filter for decoding the news?
The key is to immediately recognize the environment when the term is used and apply the correct analytical framework. You have to mentally run a diagnostic the moment you hear blue slip. If the context involves the Senate, your framework should immediately snap to personnel and geography. You are looking at a process involving federal judicial nominees and the formal solicitation of an opinion from the senators who represent the nominee's state of residence.
And if that is the case, your follow-up questions are clear. You don't ask about taxes. You ask, who is the judge, what state are they from, and what is the political dynamic between those home state senators and the administration?
Because the blue slip is the procedural pressure point where that specific dynamic plays out.
Conversely, if the context is the House of Representatives, your framework shifts entirely to legislation and origin.
Yes. You are looking at a procedural rejection of a tax or spending bill based on the House's assertion that the Senate overstepped its jurisdictional boundaries.
In that scenario, your follow-up questions have nothing to do with geography or personnel. You ask, what specific piece of financial legislation did the Senate try to initiate, and why is the House choosing this moment to aggressively assert their interpretation of the origination clause?
You look for the institutional turf war.
Exactly. By simply asking, wait, are we talking about a judge in the Senate or a tax bill in the House?
Yeah.
You instantly cut through the jargon and isolate the actual power dynamic at play.
It allows you to move past the superficial language and engage directly with the structural mechanics. You are no longer just absorbing the terminology. You are utilizing it to accurately read the institutional friction.
That is the ultimate value of dissecting these definitions. We took a single phrase from a disambiguation page and used it to map out localized gatekeeping in the Senate and constitutional boundary enforcement in the House.
It proves that the most innocuous-sounding jargon often hides the most aggressive procedural maneuvering.
It really does. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the legislative machinery of Congress. Emphasizing how a single phrase can hold massive but completely different constitutional weight depending on the context is exactly why we do this.
This raises an important question, though, and it is something we should examine before concluding. The text's reliance on the phrase House's interpretation regarding the origination clause points to a systemic vulnerability that goes beyond a simple rejection slip.
The implication being that an interpretation implies the possibility of a counterinterpretation.
Precisely. The House issues this blue slip, this outright rejection of a tax or spending bill, based entirely on their internal reading of their constitutional authority. But the Senate is a co-equal legislative body with its own constitutional scholars and its own institutional ego.
Right.
What happens when the Senate's interpretation of the origination clause fundamentally diverges from the House's?
Well, the text notes the Senate sent the bill over in the first place.
Yeah.
Which means they obviously believe they had the authority to originate it.
Yes. They drafted it, debated it, and passed it under the assumption that their actions were constitutionally sound. When the House responds not with a debate on the merits of the spending, but with a procedural rejection slip based on a conflicting interpretation of the rules, you are no longer just dealing with a policy disagreement.
You are dealing with a constitutional stalemate.
Exactly.
You essentially have two teams trying to play a game, but they are operating under two completely different rule books. and neither recognizes the authority of the other's referee. The friction isn't about the money. It is about the architecture of how the money is discussed.
And when that collision of interpretations occurs over critical, time-sensitive national spending, the result is profound legislative gridlock. The entire apparatus of government financing can grind to a halt. Not because they cannot agree on a budget number, but because they cannot agree on the procedural jurisdiction required to even begin the conversation.
Wow.
It is a stark reminder that in complex systems, the interpretation of the rules is often more contentious than the rules themselves.
That is a phenomenal lens through which to view procedural conflict. It really underscores how fragile legislative momentum can be when it runs up against deeply entrenched institutional interpretations.
Yeah.
Thank you for taking the time to decode this with us today.
Always a pleasure.
To everyone listening, keep analyzing the structures around you, keep pushing past the surface-level jargon, and we will see you on the next deep dive.